Let me start by telling you a little tiny bit about Media Smarts, the organization I work for. We're Canada's Centre for Digital and Media Literacy. We've been around since the 1990s. One of the things that we do is we have what is probably the world's largest free online collection of resources on a wide range of media literacy and digital literacy topics. We're best known probably for our lesson library for teachers, but we do have many resources for parents as well on our website, mediasmarts.ca. You're going to be sent a couple of those by email after this session that are particularly relevant to what we're talking about, but I do encourage you to check it out. So tonight, of course, we are talking about the stressful elements of our lives that come from digital communication, and in particular, how it can be stressful for young people, how the world that they're living in can have an effect on their mental wellness. I'm going to start by talking about some problems, but we're going to spend most of tonight looking at solutions. But before we do that, take a look at a couple of quick questions. And I'd like you don't have to answer out loud, but I'd like you to take a look at these and think first for yourself, and then imagine how any kids of your acquaintance might answer. Because this is one of the quizzes we use in one of our classroom materials. Would you or they say, I find it stressful to go a long time without checking social media? I could not guess how much time I spend playing online games in a week. It's probably more them than you, but you never know. I've missed out on in-person experiences because I was checking social media or playing games. I've been late for school assignments. You can substitute work if you want, because I was checking social media or playing games. I've thought I heard or felt a notification from my phone that wasn't really there. I've gotten up in the night to check my phone. We'll be back to that one. I often compare my life to other people's based on what I see on social media. I've taken down a post because it didn't get enough likes or other responses. I've checked what other people are posting about an event during that event. So checking your Instagram or your Snapchat of the party while you're at the party. And I often worry that my friends are having fun without me. Now, this is not a diagnostic tool, it's not a clinical tool, but this is a way we use to get kids thinking about how they use devices and how devices use them. And it's also based on what they themselves have told us, because one of the things that we do besides developing resources is we do research. We actually run the world's longest running research project on young people and digital technology. It's called Young Canadians in a Wired World. And we do spin-off research from that. So that's a big survey. We survey more than 5,000 students across the country every 5 years or so. And in between phases of that, we do research where we do a deeper dives into some of the themes that come up in that survey. And so a lot of the research that I'll be showing you tonight when I throw statistics and facts at you, a lot of that is from our own research. Some of it is from research around the world. But one of the really valuable things about that research is it gives us an insight into kids' lives. And so everything up here, in fact, is something that kids have told us in one way or another. Maybe not in these exact words, but these are the concerns that they have. These are the experiences that they tell us about when we ask them about digital technology and screen time. And these also are indicators of some of the areas where we need to pay attention to what kids are doing online. I'm going to start with just a real overview, a very brief overview of what the research definitively says, or nearly definitively says. Because there is a lot of research out there. A lot of it is not very well grounded. A lot of it is very alarmist. So you've probably seen newspaper articles, stuff on TV, things in magazines with very alarmist stuff about screen time, about direct connections between screen time and mental wellness. The fact is the research just isn't there. That's not to say that there's nothing to worry about. I think I'm going to be showing you that there are significant things to worry about. And that's not to say that we shouldn't do anything. But in order to make good choices, and in order to avoid throwing out the baby with the bathwater, we do need to know what the research actually says. And what the research tells us is that for young people, screen use can be positive or negative. And that's why we can't just follow that alarmist message, because we know that young people get positive things out of screens and out of digital technology. What does it depend on? Well, it depends on the activity, what they're doing, and how much time is spent. So first of all, yes, how much time you're spending does have an issue, but what you're doing is important as well. And that's why, in a way, talking about screen time is kind of meaningless. I mean, obviously, if you're spending 20 hours a day or 16 hours a day in front of screens, it's not a good thing. But if you're not at that very high end, then what matters is what they're doing with it. And in fact, research has found very high levels of screen time are connected to poor mental well-being, but very low levels are as well. Now, this is correlational research. So they're looking at how much, they're asking separate questions. How much time do you spend using screens? And ask other questions about your mental wellness. So it's unlikely that it's the lack of screens that is causing that second group to report low mental wellness. More likely, these things are connected in a more complicated way. And that's why our response has to be more than just reducing screen time. There's also a large middle ground between those two poles, the too much and the too little. There's a middle ground with no direct connection to well-being. Again, that doesn't mean there aren't things to be concerned about, but it tells us that we have to do more than count minutes. What matters primarily is what kids do with their screens. Video games, we know, can challenge minds. They can help kids develop friendships and build their identities. Video games themselves are a huge genre. Some video games are wonderful, are creative, are social, are active. Some video games aren't any of those things. Some video games are just ads. Some video games have horrible depictions of women or disadvantaged groups, just like TV. Social networks can help teens build a wider circle of friends and deepen existing relationships. We know, in fact, that for most kids, social networks today are an essential part of their social lives. Right? They're not a separate thing from their offline social lives. They're an extension of it. That has its problems as well, and we'll come back to that, but it has its benefits. Both social networks and video chatting help teens keep in touch with distant friends and with family. And this may surprise you, but in our research, the second group, the second highest group that kids like to spend time with through social media is family. They spoke to us repeatedly about how they value social networks for its ability to keep in touch with their family. Because you know what? We're all busy. Parents are busy, kids are busy. Social networks aren't just a way of keeping in touch with your friends. They're a way of keeping in touch both in just regular logistical ways. When are you going to pick me up? Oh, I need new socks. But also in emotional ways. And of course, the internet, in a broader sense, can be used to explore news, interests, contact with peers and networks, give and get feedback on creative projects. The fact is, the digital world is the world that we're living in today. Few of us can stay out of it, and even fewer of our kids will be able to. Here's what the kids themselves say. They say it has its pros and cons. So in research, young people themselves admit there are negatives to digital technology. But overall, they feel it's more positive than negative. It makes them feel less lonely. It helps them make new friends. It lets them keep in touch with their friends and family, and it connects them with support and health services. And that's tremendously important, that we guide our kids to reliable sources of information and support, because we know that when there are things that they can't talk to us about, either because they're embarrassed or just they don't feel comfortable talking to us, we need to make sure that they have someone safe and reliable to talk to or to get information from. They also say screen use can have negative effects, and not surprisingly, most of them say it has negative effects on other kids. Right? But half of kids do say they themselves spend too much time online, so this is something they are concerned with. 40% say they spend too much time on social media, and a quarter say they spend too much time on video games. So that's telling you that, again, it's not as simple as just telling them to spend less time online or less time with their devices, because in many cases they know they're spending too much time. The challenge is teaching them how to resist the ways that these devices and these platforms essentially manipulate them into using them more often, teaching them to get over the psychological and emotional factors that are separate from the technology that make us keep coming back to that technology, getting them off to a good start when they're young in terms of good habits, and modeling positive habits ourselves. Now, almost everything that I'm going to say today has to do with kids who are what you might say in the mainstream, because there's been relatively little research about screen use and particularly vulnerable kids. But we do know that the negative impacts are more powerful on kids who are vulnerable in other ways. So those teens who report having low mental well-being are more likely to say they feel bad if nobody likes or comments on their posts, and that's not surprising. If you already feel excluded, every little bit of evidence that you're excluded is going to hurt that much more. It's like Valentine's Day, right? If you already feel bad about yourself, not getting a Valentine on Valentine's Day is going to hurt twice as bad. They're more likely to say they felt left out after seeing their friends post, and they're more likely to have had negative experiences on social media. So that's not surprising. The kids who are vulnerable offline are vulnerable online as well. And kids who are generally vulnerable are more vulnerable to negative effects. But they're also more likely to say that social media has an overall positive effect on them. And that's what I mean about not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, even when it comes to vulnerable kids. Because they're the ones for whom the internet is often a lifeline. I used to teach. I was a high school teacher for 10 years. I taught in Brockville, small town in eastern Ontario. This was in the beginning, really, of the internet age. I'm not going to tell you how old I am. But I saw it. I saw kids who were vulnerable. I saw kids who were marginalized. I saw kids who didn't have a lot of friends, finding communities, finding other people who shared their interests, finding a lifeline online. Vulnerable kids are more likely to say social media makes them feel better about themselves or makes them feel less depressed. So with vulnerable kids, when we have reason to think that our kids are vulnerable, that means we need to be especially closely involved. We need to be managing more closely, taking a more active hand to make sure that they are getting those positive effects, but being aware that they are more vulnerable to the negatives as well. So, what are the signs of problematic use? And we use the term problematic use because there's really no evidence that screen use or digital technology is addictive in the medical sense. It's not like cigarettes. It's not even like gambling, unless, of course, you are gambling online, which you can do. And there are elements of video games that are similar to gambling. So you do have to be aware of those. But generally speaking, what we have is a problematic use. It's not something clinical, but it is something where we can look at identifiable signs. So the question is it causing them harm? Is it affecting the rest of their lives? So one good example, one good rule of thumb is, would you be worried if they were doing this around hockey? So think about hockey. Think about all the time people spend watching hockey, all the time people spend playing hockey, all the time people spend collecting hockey cards, reading books of hockey statistics, right? We don't worry about that. It's normal. So if what they're doing wouldn't worry you if it was about hockey. Don't worry about it if it's about digital technology, because it's normal for kids and adults to a lesser extent to get really into things for a while. So the question is it harming them and does it persist? So have they lost interest in other activities besides whatever this screen activity is? Do you often have trouble getting them to stop screen activities? Is it leading them to spend less time with family and friends? Do they get angry or upset when they can't use screens at a time they expected to? And is it the only thing, and this is probably the most important, is it the only thing that can cheer them up when they're feeling low? And keep in mind, they get many of these habits from us. So if we are out of the best intentions, if we limit screen time and then we offer it as a reward when they're good, or we offer it as something that they only get when they're sick, when they're homesick, or if we give it to them to cheer them up, we're actually training them to be more dependent on it than if we were allowing it a little bit more and in a more systematic way. Now, none of these by themselves are automatically something to be alarmed about, except maybe the last one. If you're seeing one of them persistently, or more than one of them for an extended length of time, that's when you want to be concerned. But really what's more important is that you try to avoid getting to this point. Or if you're starting to get there, that you work back. We're a member of the Canadian Pediatric Society's Digital Health Task Force. We helped come up with the recommendations for screen time for kids under 5, which were released last year. We'll be releasing recommendations for 5 and up, I believe in the spring. And what we came up with in working with them is what we call the 4M model of dealing with screen time. And you can talk about this in terms of dealing with screen time in your home, but it applies to us as well. So the first is minimize. Now, I'm going to go through all of these in detail. Mediate, model, and use media mindfully. So let's start with minimize. It's actually minimize and maximize. So first of all, you do want to minimize screen time for younger children. Kids under 2 should be spending little or no time in front of screens. That's one of the areas where the research is really strong and well established. And it's not necessarily because screens are that bad, but because they replace things that kids need at that age. And they don't get anything positive from them at that age. So a kid under 2, their brain is doing the most important development of their entire lives. Those 2 years are really the foundation of our brain development. And the way your brain develops is through physical activity, through creative play, and through social interaction with other human beings. And sensory input, getting our senses stimulated. Screens really don't offer any of those except stimulating 2 of our senses. And there's no evidence whatsoever that educational programs work under the age of 2. There's lots of stuff for sale out there because there's nothing stopping people from selling stuff and claiming it as educational benefits. But really under the age of 2, there's no evidence whatsoever that you can get an educational benefit from a TV show, from an app, from anything like that. As they get older, first of all, we want to maximize non-screen activities. So rather than saying less screens, we need to be saying more other stuff. More getting outside, more being creative, more spending time with friends, more performing, more exploring. But you have to do that. We have to do that as parents. We have to help, especially with the younger kids. We have to help provide those opportunities. We also want to maximize positive screen uses. So we want to identify which are the things that they are getting a benefit from and encourage those and then identify which are the things that maybe they're not getting such a benefit from and discourage those. So you're going to give more time to more creative, to things that are more positive. This is from our recent research. We actually did research with parents about digital wellness. There's statistics in Canada, 42% of kids from birth 40 years old have their own smartphone.
Wow.
Okay.
No way.
And it actually drops slightly, 5 to 9, then up over half for 10 to 13-year-olds, and by the mid-teen years, it's 3/4. And if you ever go out to a busy restaurant, you'll see what's being done with these phones, because they are tremendously powerful ways of quieting kids down, right? And they can be very absorbing. And it's easy to think when someone's super absorbed into something that they're getting something out of it. But certainly with the very youngest kids, and in many cases with older kids as well, they're not necessarily getting anything out of it. That's not to say you never give them something, right? There's times when, you need something to distract them for a couple of minutes, and there's nothing wrong with that. Keep in mind that that's how we establish habits. So you have to do it in a conscious way. You have to be aware that every time you do it, you're contributing to a habit, and you're actually making it harder for them to soothe themselves in other ways. And that's been shown by the research, that kids who are accustomed to soothing themselves, to quieting themselves down with screens, find it harder to soothe themselves without them. So you're actually unlearning for them what they need to learn. Half of parents said it was difficult to get their child to stop using digital technology when they were asked to. Now remember, that was one of our warning signs, right? If there's conflict about stopping, well, half of kids are already there. And we also know it's actually the #1 source of conflict in Canadian families around screen use. So that's not overall sources of conflict, but when we looked specifically at digital technology, so how they're using them comes down at 28%. What they're doing, like sites they can go to and so on, 20%. 43% is excessive use. So we know that that is the area where the most conflict is happening between parents and kids. And I think a lot of that is not just because kids have a problem with devices, although I think that is partially true, but I think it is also because we as parents don't have the information we need to make good, consistent rules. Because they very quickly suss out that our rules are arbitrary if they're just based on time. Over half of parents told us they felt the less time their child spends with digital technology, the better off they are, but 2/3 agreed their child benefits from the digital technology they use. Now that's actually very similar to the numbers we had for the kids, who told us, yeah, it's got negatives, but it's got positives as well. But here you can see these are really contradictory ideas. That yeah, they're getting benefits, but the less the better. Shows us again, minimizing is only the first step. So what do? Well, we minimize screen time for young children and we maximize non-screen activities. And I'll tell you one of the things that for me was a little bit of an epiphany in thinking about screen time, because it was 2 or 3 years ago when Pokemon Go came out. My son was a huge Pokemon fan, and at the time we had rules where we were counting screen time. And he said, does Pokemon Go count as screen time? And I really had to think about that, because on the one hand, yeah, you're using a screen, you've got a screen in front of you. And it's not screen time, because there were times when I took him out playing Pokemon Go when I had to tell him, hey, look at this thing over here that's not on the screen. This is really interesting too. But at the same time, he's outside, he's walking around. He probably got more exercise that summer. I got more exercise that summer than I ever have before. We went places we never would have gone. We did see some pretty cool things because of that. So I couldn't say yes or no. it told me that I had to start thinking in a different way. Here's another example from my younger son. My younger son loves making what are called brick films. Brick films are stop motion animation made with Lego. And they're great because he's been making them since he was 3. And at 3, he could spend an hour, 2 hours moving those little figures around, taking a shot, moving it, taking a shot. That level of focus was incredible. But at the same time, here he was with a device, spending an hour, 2 hours. Could I call that screen time? So we do have to prioritize the positive ones. How do we know if it's positive? Well, if it's social. And when I say social, I don't mean that you're acting out sociality. I don't mean that you're just liking other people's posts. And as we'll see, being sociable online can have its own risks. What I mean is that you're actively doing something with other people. So one of my rules, for instance, about video games is I'm going to allow more time for a video game where you're playing with someone else who's in the room. If you're playing the same game with someone else in the same room as you, I'm going to give more time for that because you're talking about it. You're making plans together. You're interacting. It's not just you and the device. It's you and the other person, and the device is just the intermediary. We want to prioritize screen activities that are active. So something that gets you outside, like Pokemon Go, something that gets you up and moving, like Just Dance. There are a lot of games like that. Things that are creative. And that's something you have to look carefully at because a lot of games or apps that look creative, you're actually really just, they're as creative as a color by numbers. Right? They look creative, you come up with something fancy at the end, but really all you've done is fill in the blanks. So we do have to look closely at what our kids are doing to judge, are they actually doing something creative with this? Are they actually using their imaginations, or are they just following the instructions? And educational. And again, here's an area where there are a huge number of educational resources, and there are lots of things that aren't designed to be educational but still teach valuable things. So you have to do a little bit of work. And that's really the message here, is that we have to do more work than just counting minutes. We have to be more active managers. And that especially comes up with our second M, and that is mediating screen content. And when I say mediate, what I mean is literally you're standing between your kid and the screen content. You're helping them to interpret it. You're curating it for them. So one really important way of mediating screen content is that you schedule screen time. If you want to manage total time, that's a better way to do it than giving them a time budget that they can spend any time they want. Figure out these are the times when it's okay and these are the times when it's not. And make that your routine. You can always have reasons why you may you may change the routine every now and then. Again, if they're homesick or you may have a different routine on holidays. What's most important when you're scheduling screen time is the time of the week and the time of day. So we know, for instance, that same study that told us about how the high and the low end of the screen time both had negative effects, that also found, in fact, there was no correlation with screen time on weekends. It was only screen time during the week that was correlated with mental wellness. Now, that's not saying you should just say, do as much as you want on the weekend. But it shows you that the context matters. That when they get home at 5 o'clock, when there's homework to be done, when they have to get up early the next morning, it's going to have a bigger impact. And, sorry, 1 second. And during the day, the time is super important. This is what we heard in our study from at the different ages, kids who use technology in the hour before bed, from a third up to 2/3, from the youngest to the oldest. Use of technology after they've gone to bed, from a quarter to just under a half. Those are the 2 times of day when you really do want to be as restrictive as possible. So we know that the hour before bed, it's best to have that screen free. That's best for all of us. It's not always possible, especially those of us that work long hours. You want to watch an hour of TV, go to bed. That's fine. But you want to avoid it if possible, especially with younger kids, because younger kids in general do have a harder time getting to sleep, and it can contribute to bad sleep habits. But after bed is really the time that you want to be strict about. There are a couple of reasons for that. One of those is that if you allow digital devices into the bedroom, that sleep is going to be interrupted. This is a study we did from a study a couple of years ago. We asked, do you sleep with your cell phone in case you get calls or messages in the night? Now, it's not using it as an alarm clock. That's specifically so you don't miss calls or messages. By grade 11, it was 50%. The overall total for the sample was 39%. And we know, you can just imagine, maybe some of you have this experience yourselves. You can just imagine you've got this phone next to you specifically so you don't miss anything happening. Well, how well do you think you're going to sleep in that circumstance? Kids, especially teens, need uninterrupted, deep sleep. And they need a fair bit of it. This is the cycle we get into. And if you're looking for health effects of screen time, this is where the strongest evidence is around sleep. This is where we can absolutely say, yes, there is a direct impact. That when we don't get enough sleep, obviously we're tired. It makes it harder to cope with our daily lives. It hurts our self-esteem. It leads to feelings of worry or stress, and that contributes to lack of sleep. Now that can happen, this cycle, of course, can happen without digital technology. This has probably happened to all of us at some point in our lives when there's been something stressful going on. But digital technology contributes to this in a number of different ways. So first of all, it can just directly impact our sleep. On the literal, most simplest level, if you spend an hour after you're supposed to have gone to bed on your phone, that's an hour you weren't sleeping. I mean, just that's at the most basic level. But also, we know that the quality of the sleep suffers if there's any kind of screen in the room. So that reduces sleep. We also know, in some cases, digital technology can have effects on self-esteem and also worry and stress. And in many cases, it's worry and stress that's making them bring the phone into the room with them. We'll come back to that idea. But that's why we have to address this in a way with multiple dimensions. Okay, so you're curating the time. You also want to curate screen content. Now, in some ways, for parents, this is a golden age. Because when I was growing up, there was just what was on TV. And it was very difficult for my parents, even if they had wanted to tell me what to watch on TV, because there were only, when I was a kid, there were only 4 channels. Eventually there were, 15 channels, something like that. But there were only so many options, right? So if they were going to let me watch TV, they had to let me watch what was on. Now, my kids don't understand this concept of on. This idea that something is on at a particular time, right? Because they've got Netflix, they've got YouTube. If they want to watch, we used to watch TVO Kids on, but now they can get it online. So this gives us, as adults, tremendous power to curate what our kids are watching. We have a lot more control, especially when they're young, over what they're watching. But keep in mind that the platforms are doing their own curation, and sometimes those don't follow what we want them to. So I showed you TVO Kids and Netflix as good examples of places where you have a fair amount of control. A lot of kids watch YouTube. YouTube's not really made for kids. It's supposed to be 13 and under, but they know that lots of kids watch it. This was, for a while there, the recommendation algorithms on YouTube, and YouTube says that 70% of views aren't people selecting things. 70% of views on YouTube are made based on the recommendation algorithm. They're on clicking. If you know YouTube, that bar along the right that's recommended for you. That's 70% of views. And what was happening was people were watching a real episode of Peppa Pig, and they had recommended to them these unauthorized versions, and some of them were just simple knockoffs, and some of them had some really disturbing stuff in them. And kids would just get to this stuff, and people were producing, because it's so cheap to make animation today. People were making cartoons literally based on search terms. And so you would have a video of Spider-Man and Elsa unboxing Kinder eggs, because those were the most popular search terms. Spider-Man and Elsa and unboxing and Kinder eggs, those were the most popular search terms, and they would get people to dress up as Spider-Man and Elsa and open a box of Kinder eggs, and there was your video, and they made $1,000 or however much. So what do you want to do? Well, if you're going to let, first of all, if you're going to let them use YouTube, have them stick to channels. Okay, there are channels on YouTube. You can go back to that old idea of channels. Things aren't on at a particular time, but you can identify the channels that have positive content or content you're happy with and have them stick there. The one thing you absolutely have to do if you're letting kids watch YouTube is turn off autoplay. Because if you don't turn that off, it's going to play the top item on the recommended list automatically. If you don't, if it's off, it just stops, and you have to pick something else. And you can create a playlist. So you can pick, you can say, what are the videos you want to watch? Find them, add them to the playlist. You can say, okay, you're going to watch half an hour of YouTube. We've got half an hour of videos on the playlist. Off you go. All right, so you can curate it. You can investigate. You can find the ones that you approve. And that's what I say. My older son doesn't watch a lot of videos. My younger son does. And I say, okay, if you're watching Netflix, we'll pick it together. And then I know there's kids' Netflix has been already curated. If you want to watch stuff on YouTube, you have to tell me what you want to watch. And we're going to set you up a playlist. The other part of curation is co-viewing with your kids. Now, co-viewing doesn't always mean actually sitting next to them while they're watching. You can co-view from another room. You can co-view after, right? You don't have to actually be there, although that's ideal. Because if you're talking to your kids about their media experiences, you can co-view with them then. What do you want to do? Well, you want to look for teachable moments. You want to look for things that come up in the content, in whatever they're watching or playing, that give you an opportunity to talk about things that concern you. You want to extend their learning. So when there is something educational, whether it's intended to be educational or not, the research is really strong that educational media is much more effective when parents or other caregivers extend the learning by talking about it, by saying, oh, let's try that in real life. Oh, you just saw something about bugs. Let's go see the bugs at the museum. Something like that. It doesn't necessarily have to be that involved, but extending the learning. You want to share their enthusiasms. You want to know what it is that they like. What are they enjoying? What are they playing? What are they watching? Why do they like it? That's really important, because if they feel that you're judging the stuff that they like, that you're being negative and critical towards it, they're going to stop talking to you about it, because they really like it and they want to talk to you. Take advantage of those at age when kids are young and they want to talk to you about things, when they want to tell you all about it. And if you do that, they're going to keep talking. But you can ask questions. And that's the most important part of co-viewing. Because what you want to do with co-viewing, the main purpose of co-viewing, is turning kids into critical consumers of media. That's media literacy. You're training them to be media literate by co-viewing. Media literacy doesn't mean being negative about media. In fact, the heart of media literacy is teaching kids that you can criticize something and still like it, or that you can like something but still criticize it. That you can say, I like this, I enjoy this, but here are some things about it that I wish were different, or that I'm not sure I'm comfortable about. So co-viewing, like all media literacy, is based on what we call 5 key concepts, 5 basic ideas that you want to teach your kids about media. These are the same key concepts that we use in teaching media literacy from kindergarten through to grade 12. They were actually developed right here in Ontario, but today they're used around the world. And the first is that media are constructions. That is to say that somebody made every media product, from a TV show to a video game to a cereal box, was made by someone for a purpose. Now that may seem obvious, but keep in mind, we've only had media for a fraction of the history of our species. When we see something, when we hear something, we're wired to treat it as real. If we don't remind ourselves that somebody made it. But media are imperfect. Even in the best case scenario, media are imperfect reflections of reality. Documentary movies, of course, documentaries are trying to accurately reflect reality. Well, a documentary shoots 200 hours of footage for every hour that actually makes it on screen. So think about all that stuff that got left out. Well, that's reality too, but it doesn't make it on screen. Even if you took a camera, even if we just took that camera over there and we just pointed it, and we did nothing else than that, we just pointed it and let it film whatever was in front of it, that's still leaving out everything that's not in front of the camera. And of course, most of the time, people are making choices. They're making choices about what to leave in, choices about what to take out, choices about who's important, who's the star, who's good, who's bad. All of those are ways in which the constructed media don't necessarily reflect reality. So how do we get this across? Well, we remind our kids that media texts were made by people. You can talk to them about that. You can remind them. And there's some great kids' books that are a really good way of getting this across for young kids. So the True Story of the Three Little Pigs is a good one. Also the Chester books by Melanie Watt, where Chester the cat is talking back to the author. That was another good way. That was a really good way with my kids of helping them understand. And as they're getting older and they're getting more enthusiastic about particular media texts, you can help them learn more about, oh, okay, these are the people who made this, and this is how it was made. Help them to think about the decisions these people made. So help them think, okay, why did they choose to do it this way instead of that way? Why do you think they chose to do this animated instead of live action? And encourage them to make their own media. In fact, there's no better way to teach kids that media are constructions than by giving them the opportunity to construct media. And that's so much easier than it once was. You can get media, you can get animation apps, you can get filmmaking apps that are free, you can get them on any phone, on any computer. The amount of power that we have today to make media compared to even 10 years ago is astonishing. So take advantage of that. Okay, second key concept, media have commercial implications. That is to say, almost all media are created to make money for the creator. And all media cost money to create. So those are the two commercial considerations. First of all, most likely it was created to make money in some way. But in every case, it costs someone money to make it. Sometimes not a whole lot of money. When you've got a YouTuber playing Minecraft and filming himself playing Minecraft, that didn't take a whole lot of time and money, although sometimes more than you'd think. Often they have pretty expensive microphones and cameras to get good quality. But at the bottom end of that, may not cost a lot. And of course, at the other end, you've got your Harry Potter movies that cost $150 million to make. But no matter what, there's some resources going in there, and that we can't understand media without understanding that. So one of the things we can do that early on is to point out advertising in places your kids might not notice it. So when you go to the grocery store, for instance, we don't always realize that, for instance, food packaging is an ad. Right? That when you go into the grocery store, every single food package is trying to sell itself to you in some way. And you can say, well, look at this cereal for kids. Notice how it's exactly at kid height on the shelf. Look how it's got all these cartoon characters. Some of the more expensive ones have cartoon characters you recognize from other cartoons. Some of them have just cartoon characters that were invented by the cereal company. And then look up here at the grown-up eye level, and we've got totally different cereal boxes. They may not look as much like ads, but they're ads too. They're just selling to a different audience. And as they get older, we want them to think about how they pay for the products that they use. We did a study last year, 2 years ago, with teenagers. We asked them, it was mostly about how they make decisions around sharing photos. But because it was about photo sharing like apps like Instagram and Snapchat, we asked them about whether they knew how Instagram and Snapchat made money, and if they understood what they were agreeing to when they clicked on I agree and signed on to use those services. And of all the kids we interviewed, only one had any idea how these platforms make money. And I don't blame the kids. I don't blame them one bit, because those platforms, and so many of the platforms that we use, go out of their way to hide how they make money off of us. If you're using Facebook, lots of people, lots of adults use Facebook without knowing how Facebook makes money. If you're using Google, Google feels free. You may not recognize how they're making money. Of course, they're making money by advertising to you, the same way broadcast TV makes money. But they're also making money by collecting data about you based on what you do there, and either selling access to that data to advertisers or selling that actual data to advertising brokers. And in most cases, they make more money off that than they actually do from the advertising, from displaying the ads. That's not necessarily a bad thing. There's nothing inherently wrong with that business model. But if you don't understand what you're selling, then you're not in a very strong position as a consumer. And so we need to help them understand this is how they're making money off of you. This is the contract you agreed to. We also have to teach them that they have influence as consumers and that they have options. Not every search engine tracks you. Not every social network tracks you, although there's harder to find a social network that doesn't track you, and it's, of course, harder to go to a non-tracking social network because you've got to go to the social network all your friends are on. Our third key concept, media have social and political implications. That is to say, media have meaning. And the meaning is not necessarily something that was intended by the people who made the media. I mean, there certainly are examples. I was a high school teacher, I told you, for 10 years. I've mostly taught English. I know all the books. Most of you probably, if you went to school in Ontario, you've probably read the same books that I taught. Things like 1984, things like Brave New World, Lord of the Flies. Those are the things as teachers we like to teach because the authors had a clear meaning, so they're easy to teach. We're kind of lazy that way. But the fact is, most of the time, people who write books or make movies or create comic books or video games, they don't have any meaning in mind, but that doesn't mean the meaning isn't there. And in fact, those meanings are more powerful because we're not consciously aware of them. But we all get messages from media. Again, going back to that idea that media are constructions, we get the idea, we get messages about what reality is from media. We know, for instance, that people's idea of how common violent crime is not really related to the actual violent crime rate. What it's related to is the portrayal of violent crime in media. We've seen over the last 10 years, particularly in the US, we don't have as good data here in Canada, but we've seen in the United States, people's perception of how common violent crime is has been rising, while actual violent crime has been declining, but portrayal of it has been rising. We get a lot of our ideas about gender from media, and those typically are not intentional. Often they're from the questions that people didn't ask. And they're not always from a single text. Often they're from a lot of texts together. So if you see one cartoon or play one video game where the main character is a white male, that by itself doesn't necessarily have a lot of meaning. But if you watch 99 cartoons where the main character is a white male and only one where the main character is anything else, put together, all of that makes meaning because that's sending powerful messages. So we can talk, for instance, about how boys and girls are portrayed differently in media. And we can express our own opinions. We can say, I remember when my younger kid especially, was into Paw Patrol. And that was a test for me. That was a test to not be negative. But I said, there are a lot of things I like about this show, but I don't like that there's only one girl dog and that she wears pink and that she only ever helps the other dogs and that there's one female character who is only ever a helper, who never even has an adventure. But I had to be very careful to phrase it in an overall positive way, that this is one thing I don't like about it. Ask kids which actions are rewarded in media and which are punished. That's one of the strongest ways that media have messages, is by showing you this kind of behavior gets rewarded and this is punished, and sometimes that may be different by gender as well. And point out the choices made by media creators. So again, go back to that idea of media as constructions. Point out that these are all choices the creators made. They may not have been conscious choices. They may have just been doing this because everyone else does it, or they may just have been doing this because they wanted this to be like the stuff they grew up on, the stuff they fell in love with, and so they're just not asking questions. But point out that these are choices. People will react differently to different media constructions. So the meaning of a media text isn't fixed. We all bring our own experience and our own identity to it. And that's tremendously empowering because that's the root of saying, you can like this and see it's perfectly fine, and I can like it but have problems with it. So we can ask kids whether they think they're the intended audience for a text and how do they know. Again, cereal boxes are a great way to talk about this. I remember being asked, well, why does this cereal box have, I forget what it was, like C-3PO on it? Well, because it's trying to sell to kids. Talk about how it feels different to watch something that isn't aimed at you. And that's a really interesting experience. It can be interesting sometimes when something really isn't aimed at you to watch it, because it's a very different experience. It's sometimes an alienating experience when you're used to being the person that it's aimed at. But it can be very powerful as well. I remember my kids, I don't remember how it was, but a couple of years ago they started watching the new version of My Little Pony, right? Which is definitely not aimed at them. But they actually found they really liked it. And they actually found that the characters in it, they could relate better to the characters in it than they could relate to the characters in stuff that was aimed more directly at who they were, than in boy stuff, because they felt they were more like these characters, and there was a wider range of character types of people, of personalities that it was okay to be. And help them think about what it's like to not see yourself reflected in media. Not maybe their experience already, or it may not be. And finally, each medium has a unique aesthetic form, or in the immortal words of Marshall McLuhan, the medium is, to a certain extent, the message. We can help them to get at that by reading a book that your kids like and then see how it's been adapted into another medium. And talk about which parts were kept, which were changed, and which were cut. So that goes again back to the idea of construction and choices. So one of the things we did was we read the Harry Potter books, and at the end of each book we'd watch the movie. And that was a great opportunity to talk about, well, why did they change this? Why did they change that? Well, they cut that because it was too expensive. Or, well, they added that because they wanted to appeal to so-and-so. Or, oh, they added that because clearly they wanted to sell a toy based on it. Or anything like that. It doesn't have to be that complicated. All right. So that's mediate. Our third M is modeling good screen habits. This is from our own research. More parents agreed than disagreed that they're poor role models when it comes to digital technology habits for their kids. So there was about a little over a third that felt they were bad role models, about a third felt they were good role models, and the remaining third were in between. They didn't feel strongly one way or another. But it shows that in many ways we are conscious, or we're becoming increasingly conscious of the messages that we send through our own media use. And what we do, what we model, is probably the most powerful way of influencing our kids. When they're young, it's because they look to us for how to behave. When they get to be teens, it's because teenagers are incredibly good at detecting hypocrisy. And if they feel that we're being hypocrites, they're not going to listen to us. What do they say themselves? They're not the only ones with a screen time problem. Half say their parents are sometimes distracted by their phones when talking to them. I have a really simple rule. I try to make sure my phone is less interesting than my kids, so that I'm not going to be tempted. And I have a smartphone and I have email on it, but when I set it up, I didn't put on Twitter, because I know that's for me. That's maybe for different people have different problems. For me, that's my Achilles heel is Twitter. That's the thing that I go to when I just want to do something mindless for a couple of minutes. I didn't put on Facebook, and I turned off all the notifications. When I first got it, it had 1 million notifications. The Weather Channel was notifying me every time the temperature changed. Right? I turned all of that stuff off because it's really important to me that I'm more interested in my kids than in my phone. And it's not weak to admit that, because this technology is powerful. And sometimes we need to discipline ourselves. Here are some actual things. When they were asked what rules they felt parents should follow, they said, put down the phone when your child is trying to say something important. Don't spend all your free time on this stuff. Don't post anything about me without asking me. That's another important thing we can model is consent. Right? Last week, my son was chosen to lay the wreath, my younger son, at the Remembrance Day ceremony. And I knew his grandparents would want to see that. They couldn't come. So I asked him, I got a picture, and I asked him, is it okay to share this? And he said, well, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that. And I said, well, how about if I only share it with people that are in your family? And he said, that's okay. So I put it on Facebook, and that's the only thing I use Facebook for. And on Facebook, you can actually select, not just friends or not friends, you can actually select individual people to share a post with. So that's what I did. But I thought a little bit after that about, in that moment, how disappointed I was and why I was disappointed. And I thought, you know, the reason I'm disappointed is because I know I would have gotten a lot of likes for that photo. And most of them would have been likes from people that I barely know. People that I met one time somewhere, and they sent me a friend request, and I said, sure, and they see a picture of a cute kid, and they like it. And I thought, do I really want these people's approval? Do I really want these likes that much? And that's the last point, is practice what you preach. We have to reflect on our own use. We have to reflect. If we're going to teach our kids how to use media in a positive way, we have to reflect on our own use and make sure we're modeling things positively. And that brings us to our final M, and that is the need to use screens mindfully. And that's probably the most important of all of them. Not just how much time, not just what we're doing, but that we're using them in a mindful way, that we're using them rather than them using us. Now, there are some challenges to using media mindfully that come from digital media specifically. Now, that's not to say that we automatically used pre-digital media, traditional media, in a mindful way. Because in some ways it was easier in those old days when there was stuff on, right? You could just sit down on the couch, you could turn it on the TV, and you could just watch whatever TV offered you, or you could channel surf, right? So we certainly did use pre-digital media in an unmindful way. But there are things about it, about digital media, that make it harder to be mindful. So this is, when I talk about pre-digital or traditional media, this is what I mean, that in those days, media was broadcast. A small number of people created media, controlled the distribution channels, and sent it out. Most of us were at the end of a chain. So you could consume media, but you couldn't do much more with it. But today, we're in the middle of a network. Because the network is infinite, we're all in the middle of it. We're receivers, but we're also senders. And that has some important implications for how hard it is to use it mindfully. Like every other medium, like every other text, digital media platforms and apps are created to get us to use them in particular ways. So many of them are interactive, and interactivity, the fact that we're interacting with the app or you are interacting with other people through it, is something that makes us use it more. That's why, for instance, video games that have a social component, where you're interacting with other people online, are more habit-forming. We're more likely to spend time with those than single-player games. Embodiment. We project a certain amount of our own identity. To a certain extent, our online profile is us. And so when something happens to us online, we feel it in a real way. Digital technology is always on. It never turns off. And so there's a concern that we're going to miss something. And it's designed to maximize engagement. Because again, that's how almost all of these platforms make money. They make money by advertising to you. You're more likely to respond to ads and see ads the more engaged you are. And so they are designed to get you engaged. That's why, for instance, recommendation algorithms, whether it's YouTube or Facebook, they'll show you things that they think you're more likely to respond strongly to. It's one of the reasons why fake news spreads faster than real news. The algorithm actually favors fake news because people respond strongly to it, whether they like it or dislike it. It's those strong responses that get picked up by the algorithm. Sometimes this is really obvious how this happens. How many people here know what a Snapchat streak is? Yeah, okay. So in Snapchat, if you send someone a snap and they send it back to you, or they send something back to you, within 24 hours, you start a streak. And every day that you send a snap back and forth with that same person, a number gets added to the streak. If you ever stop, the streak is broken. And it's a little picture, like a little fire. And you can have lots of them going at the same time with a lot of your different friends. So this is really obviously training you to come back at least once a day to each of these streaks. And we had, in that same study I told you about earlier, we heard about kids who the last thing they did before going to bed, they would spend half an hour just keeping up all their streaks. We heard about kids just putting their thumb over the lens of the camera on their phone and sending out black pictures just to keep up the streaks. We had kids giving their phone to a friend to keep up their streaks while they were on vacation. And this doesn't count for anything. You don't get anything from a streak. It's pure behavior modification. It's purely keeping you engaged by giving you a number that goes up every day if you don't break the streak. So that's a really, in a way, crude example. Many of the things that social networks and other platforms do to keep us engaged are much more subtle. But make no mistake, the people who make these are trying to keep us engaged. But there's also emotional elements to digital technology that keep us more engaged. So because we're interacting with people we know, compared to traditional media where you didn't see your next door neighbor on TV, you saw famous people on TV. But with social media, with digital media in general, we're interacting with our peers, with people that we know, and so we naturally are more engaged and we compare ourselves to them. There's social pressure to participate because, of course, that's where half of kids' social lives happen. That's why it's one thing to say, well, okay, stop using this search engine and use this other search engine because it doesn't track you. Okay, that's relatively easy. But you can't do the same thing with a social network unless you get all your friends to come with you. Now that has happened. That was why kids started using Snapchat, because it had better, in their minds, it gave them better control over their privacy. Not because they actually believed that those snaps were gone forever, but because by using Snapchat, it sent a message to their friends not to save this stuff. Don't take this seriously. So that can happen, but that's a lot of work, and it's really got to appeal to them. And finally, there's the issue that when we're looking at social media, we're seeing the highlight reel from our friends' lives and living the blooper reel of our own. Because we know all the bad things that happen in our lives. We see ourselves in the mirror at 6 in the morning. We see ourselves in the mirror at 1 in the morning. We know all the bad things that happen to us. We know all our failings. But we don't share that online. With our friends and with our peers and other people we know online, we only see the good stuff. So we're constantly comparing these perfect lives to our own imperfect lives. This is from that study I told you about. Why are they posting? You want to post to impress people. You don't even think about your own self. You kind of stop thinking about your own needs. That was a 14-year-old girl we interviewed. So they were telling us that often when they're posting on social media, they're not doing it for themselves. They're doing it because they feel a need to participate, that they have to put up a front for other people. Another one, 15-year-old. Most people post photos to make it look good. The photo should look good, or your life should look good, or you should look good. So again, there's a pressure to put up that perfect life. And I say pressure because it has that effect on us. It is stressful to be constantly curating. And part of that is constantly selecting who's going to see each thing that I post, and making sure that the wrong people don't see things, and this thing goes on my Instagram account, and this thing goes on my fake Instagram account, and this thing goes on my Snapchat account, this thing goes on my flop account, right? You hear all of these things, all of these strategies that kids have come up with to try to curate their streams, and they tell us it's incredibly stressful. But, of course, if they step away, they feel the fear of missing out. They fear, I am going to miss something amazing, or even if it's not amazing, I'm going to miss out on what everyone else is going to be talking about tomorrow. So those are all the challenges, the particular challenges to using digital media mindfully. One of the most important steps to getting kids to use media mindfully is to set times and places with no devices. So particularly with younger kids, you want to say these are the times and places when we can use devices. As they get older, it becomes these are the times and places where you can't, but you do have to preserve some of those times and places. So we found, for instance, 40% of parents said they had screen-free meals, which is great. You do want to find those times and places where you just have to say no. The dinner table, the bedroom. Other times you can pick family outings, whatever makes sense to you. But that's sending a message that we're choosing to use media at particular times for particular reasons. And that's what mindful use is all about. And that's why we have to model it as much as teach it, because we have to think about the messages we're sending. Think about when you take out your phone, when you turn on the computer, when you turn on the TV, what messages are you sending? What habits are your kids learning from you? Now, I already told you that kids themselves are concerned about this. They sometimes can be very eloquent.
Have you ever wondered how connected you are?
For 2 weeks, we kept track of our media use.
What we were doing and why.
Keeping Snapchat streaks.
Looking for memes.
Listening to music.
Doing homework.
Organizing our lives.
Watching Netflix.
Then we took a media fast for 7 full days and kept track again.
We let ourselves do some things.
Like texting our parents to pick us up.
Watch movies with our families.
Listening to music as long as you didn't have headphones on.
And doing our homework.
But other than that, we stopped everything.
Before the fast, I thought it was going to be a disaster.
Super boring.
Annoying, and it was, but I got used to it, eventually.
I didn't find it as hard as I thought it would be.
I found it was more open-minded.
The first day I was wondering about my shows, but then I sort of forgot and it was okay. I actually didn't really miss it much.
Once you try it, it's not actually that bad. During the fast, I found the day just really stretched out and I did more stuff.
I hung out with friends in person.
Did homework well before deadlines.
Listened to music with friends and family.
I thought deep thoughts. I ended my Snapchat streaks, and some of them were with people I didn't even know.
I read a lot.
Ate cookies. And went downtown.
I talked to my mom more during car rides.
I was surprised by how much thinking I did.
I lost a lot of my Snapchat streaks. I always thought I'd feel sorry, like I had some connection to them or something. But a lot of the people I didn't even know in person, and I Snapchatted them for over 100 days. Like, no offense, that was kind of a waste of my time. I don't think we realize how much we do use technology. We just think that it's part of our routine, so we don't think about what we're doing. And then when we weren't using technology for a week, I realized how much I did use technology, even though I didn't think I did.
I realized how much time I actually had left when I didn't use social media.
During the fast, it was easier for me to fall asleep because there was no distractions. I think technology does affect how you think and how you socialize with people. If you use technology way too much, you'll have no social skills.
I absolutely don't need this to survive, but I would still rather have it.
But since the fast, I've been using technology differently.
I don't even spend as much time on Snapchat anymore.
I'm toning it down a bit, and I haven't been caring about it as much.
So when I'm bored, I'm like, okay, I should go outside. And then I go outside and I actually have fun.
Social media can suck you in. Some people won't talk to each other face to face. They won't spend time with the family. They won't go outside. They won't do stuff or experience stuff.
This experiment helped me to see that I don't actually use much social media.
You can live without it, and there's nothing stopping you from doing that except for you.
There are lots of challenges on social media.
So we challenge you to stop altogether.
For just 7 days.
Disconnect and see what happens. Can you do it?
What I think that shows us, and what I think a lot of the data we have from kids themselves shows us, is that it's a mistake to believe that kids chose this life and this way of living. They didn't. We chose it for them. They've grown up in it. And it's very hard for us to say to them to stop doing it, because they've never known any other life. And that's why mindfulness is at the heart of it. As much as minimizing screen time in general is important and maximizing positive uses, as much as mediating media is fundamental, and what we model, of course, is essential as well, what we all, adults and kids together, need to learn is to use media more mindfully. And one of the valuable things about something like that 7-day fast is that it gives us something to compare it to, because our kids have known no other life. So how do we use media mindfully? Well, it comes under 3 main headings. First of all, because the time that we use with digital media can expand infinitely, we need to manage our time. We need to teach kids how to manage their time, because they're growing up in a world with an infinite amount of distractions. And a lot of the stress that they have comes from feeling like they don't have enough time to do all the things they need to do. So we need to teach them to prioritize. Now, that can mean prioritizing our lives. You can think of your life as like a glass, right? You fill things in order. You put the most important things in first, and then see how much room you have for other things. And digital media goes in there pretty late. Teach them to use a planner, and make sure that they're scheduling social media breaks when they're working. So if you want to use social media, don't have it constantly binging you with notifications. If you really can't just turn it off, if you really just can't turn off Snapchat or Instagram for the night or for the day, say ahead of time, these are the times when I'm going to allow myself to do it, and I'm not going to do it other times. And you know, that's what I do with Twitter, because I told you Twitter's my problem. And I found it was affecting my work. So I said, okay, I'm only going to check Twitter once an hour. And sometimes I do it less often. Sometimes if I'm really busy, I say, okay, I'm only going to do it once every 2 hours. But I found I did need to do that because it was creeping up on me. We need to change our mental and emotional habits. We need to get out of the habit of comparing ourselves with others. That's really strongly associated with body image issues. It's strongly associated with anxiety. We have to learn how to be where we are. I went on a trip to Churchill, Manitoba with my kids. We were out on the boat, belugas all around us. I was taking pictures. My son said, "Dad, just look at the whales. You don't need to take pictures of it." We have to learn not to take things personally, and we have to teach our kids not to take things personally. And that's a very easy thing to do because, of course, teenagers are the most egocentric beings in the universe. But you do have to learn. It's not all about you. If someone else's post gets 100 likes and your post gets 20 likes, it's not necessarily about you. It's about that particular moment. It's about that particular event. And we need to teach them to be honest. That thing I was telling you about, the blooper reel and the highlight reel, that comes because we're not honest. But actually, the research shows there's a lot of value. A lot of the value in social media, the emotional value, comes from being honest. That if we're not honest, if we're not willing to share the bad things that happen to us, if we are trying to keep up that perfect facade, then it doesn't have any of those benefits. And finally, we do need to schedule time for R&R. I already talked about turning off notifications, logging out at bedtime, and logging all the way out. Right? We need to schedule off time every day. And finally, periodically take a tech vacation. Sometimes it's going to be a day, maybe a weekend. Maybe you'll try the disconnect challenge, try a whole week. But all of this adds up to a way to use media mindfully. Because the fact of the matter is, our kids are growing up in a world that is full of media. We've gone in a generation from having to go out and seek out media, from having a diet to having a buffet. These are skills we didn't need to learn, but we need to teach our kids. And we have a terrific opportunity because these technologies have as many positives as negatives. They are gateways to incredible things, but we have to make sure that our kids are able to manage them, that they're able to use them mindfully, and get as many of the benefits as they can without the drawbacks.